I arrived at Tulane as a student. I had been in the Peace Corps in Thailand and encountered a number of Thai colleagues who had actually trained at Tulane because the program at the time was hosting a lot of mid-career professionals from around the world under a USAID program. And so when they heard I was thinking about switching from a pre-med undergrad focus to a public health focus, which is what Peace Corps did for me, they said, "Oh, you have to go to Tulane." And so then I also thought about the fact that I had lived most of my life in the United States in Minnesota, which is at the other end of the Mississippi. So what could be more appropriate than to come to the mouth of the Mississippi and see what life was like down here. So that's what brought me to Tulane as a master's program participant. I stayed for my doctorate, and then I flew the coop and revisited a few times between DrPH graduation and joining the faculty. About 10 years or so in between those two. So I did a lot of other things in between and then joined the faculty full-time in 1996. One of the first big stories I was quoted in was with the New York Times when they were looking at, the explosive experience we had here in New Orleans in the very first months of the pandemic. And we're looking for local people who could speak to that particular problem. And then once, one person's, source becomes another person's source, and then I became, on a short list at Tulane Communications, built up of people who could be, were willing and reliably, able and available to speak on any number of different topics. But on the local level, I had a whole raft of local reporters who were, at the height of the pandemic, contacting me on an almost daily basis. There, in the peak of the pandemic, it was a lot.
If everybody would wear a mask and pay attention to the most basic of these public health restrictions, we could open up a lot more. It is very, very helpful to us to understand whether we have 20% of the population or 60% of the population that has been infected. That gets to the idea of herd immunity.
Trying to find ways to translate what is sometimes really dense and obtuse information and, in scientific jargon into something that would be more digestible and understandable to a lay population was something that, I felt like I could do.
You have to remember we were testing very differently. We were only testing people who were sick. And if young people are less likely to get sick, they weren't going to have an opportunity to be tested and be identified as positive.
And if your priority is to gather with family and have them around for next Christmas too, then you should wear a mask indoors unless you're actively eating. And I would recommend, given how warm it's going to be in Louisiana this Christmas, that you eat outdoors.
The ship is hitting the iceberg and, we're still having dinner.
I never had any training in how to interact with media. I never went through a media workshop. I've probably broken all the rules that you're supposed to maintain with media. But I think part of what helped me to interact and respond is that in addition to my pre-med training, I trained in theater as well. And so I kind of viewed it as a performance and kind of an, let's see, what's the word? Improvisational performance. I mean, I know my stuff, and that helps a lot. I could predict by, the 10th or 15th or 20th interview what kinds of questions they were likely to ask. So, I had that information down cold, and then I was just really comfortable at extemporaneous speaking. I think my legacy is really the students that I've had the opportunity to work with, and that's where I think where I will take the greatest satisfaction from my career here at Tulane is helping to launch a couple of cohorts of public health professionals some who stayed in academia, some who did other things but are still contributing. And for me, that's what's been most satisfying. A lot of that happening in informal relationships, although clearly I've heard from students that, you know, they felt like specific things that we covered in class or activities we did in class were important in preparing them to get the jobs that they had wanted coming out of school or even a bit later.